Hello
Yeah.
and welcome to a very special episode of the Doc Y Exchange. Today, we're kicking off Cybersecurity Awareness Month with a unique conversation. I'm joined by someone whose personal and professional story has so many interesting layers. She's an expert in automation and cloud infrastructure, specializing in creating secure and agile systems. But her journey to this point is one I'm excited to explore. Welcome, Dr. Durr, the Operational Analytics and Tooling VP for Corporate Tech Agility for JP Morgan Chase and Company. Good evening.
Good evening. It's so good to be here, and thank you so much for the warm introduction as well.
Oh, thank you. It's so great to have you here with us today. When I started reading some of your story on Facebook, I immediately knew we had to get you on the Doc Y Exchange. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. There's so much to dive into, but before we get into your professional work, I'd love to start by hearing a little bit about your background. So, can you tell us what led you to the work you're doing today?
So I got to the work I'm doing today through really a few different, I guess, kind of channels that life took. So it's kind of an interesting journey. On one aspect, I work in tech specifically because I had a high interest in technology from a young age, and I was lucky enough to be one of the first people in my neighborhood that had a personal computer at home. But admittedly, it was partially because my dad owned his own trucking company, and wanted to like be engaged in technology so that he could have opportunities from that. But then also because my dad was really into online horse gambling, and they were actually one of the first sports to embrace technology, interestingly enough. And so my dad went all in on like PC computing for gambling, really more than anything. And so he was like, "Hey, can you help me?" And so I was there alongside my dad's user journey as he was learning how to use a computer. And in that, got really interested in computers and how systems specifically work. As I was like helping him engage with this new budding system that was being used really for gambling. But to me, it was really interesting how it was being done, and how they were taking something that was being done in the physical realm and transitioning it over to the digital space. And that just like amazed me as a young person and got me engulfed in everything from PC gaming to building computers. And so I knew technology was going to be a big part of my journey, but I also had my mind set on getting some kind of advanced degree from a young age because I was an individual with a learning disability and I was the child of two high school dropouts. And so I knew I was going to get advanced degrees, and I knew that I wanted to do something that I thought would make a lot of money. So I was looking at being like a scientist, or like a doctor of some kind. And then I landed here at a PhD as like a sort of middle ground because I didn't want to commit to going to like medical school or something. So that's it. And then there wasn't really a degree for what I do now. So admittedly, it was just me piecing together various parts and components. I also had a strong interest in politics and strategy. And so together, technology, strategy, my dad had his own business and was into government contracting. So I also got into consulting early. And then all that together, it kind of grew into what it is today. And then add in the entrepreneur and the arts, because I also do creative things personally as well. And that's kind of how I got here. And I was just put into the arts from a young age because my parents were concerned that I was shy, but I was really a child with autism. And so that backfired into now me really enjoying the arts. And it's something that I always lean into heavily, as I think it really gives me a leg up as a PhD and someone who works in tech and all these areas where you don't really see as many creative people kind of showcasing their creative talents in a big way.
Awesome. Okay. So I didn't get all of that on Facebook, but I'm glad that you shared all of those pieces because
No problem.
they go together to shape like who you are and give you a perspective that I don't per se have. I'm the parent of someone on the spectrum, but that is very different from the perspective that you would have. So let me ask you this. How do you think those early experiences actually shape the way you approach your work today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of my work today, um, it's actually been a really interesting journey because at different parts of my life, I had really focused on each of those areas individually because I think one of the things we learn in our schooling, or we think we learn in our schooling early on, is that you have to focus on one thing and you have to pick something to study and you have to, go after a job in that specific area. And so I spent a long time trying to figure out which of these areas I wanted to focus on. And then through kind of really my own just self exploration and maturing personally, I figured, like, why am I trying to separate these parts of myself? Because it's really kind of putting me in this situation where I'm having to pick and choose what my gifts are. And in reality, I just have different gifts. And together, it's about finding something where I can take all of those gifts and use them in a way that actually drives me as one individual person versus feeling like I'm being pulled in all these different directions. So I'm able to use all of those different skill sets in what I do now by really approaching what I do at work with a research lens, but also sort of a creative, visionary, innovator lens as a result of all of these unique experiences. So I use it to drive me to be able to look at problems in a way that I don't think necessarily everyone is able to do. And so I can take these really huge, complex problems, and break them down in a way that is simple for a regular person to digest, regardless of any sort of learning disabilities or differences that they might have as well, because I'm able to pick up on different learning styles and really hone my approach in a strategic way to the needs of the audience that I'm working with. And because I also have a disability, I'm very aware of the fact that people do have different needs, and you can't just disseminate information one way and expect everyone to just get it.
Right. Accessibility
Hmm.
and tailoring and meeting people where they are and not trying to have them meet you and modify who they are naturally to meet an
Exactly.
expectation that is not realistic because we're all different. Um,
Yeah.
and that's fine. And I think we need more people who are aware and truly try to explore how to meet the needs of others by accepting them the way they are.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that's really a big part of empathetic leadership as well. So I think it also makes me a leader in what I do also, which I think is critical if you're going to do something unique. You need to be comfortable being a leader because you're going to be sort of leading the way and setting the trend for hopefully what will be future generations of people that will take a similar journey.
Yes, absolutely. So it sounds like balancing the technical side of things with the humanistic side of things is part of the key to your approach.
Mhm.
In an industry that's constantly evolving, how do you strike
Yeah,
the balance between innovation and we're going to kind of shift the conversation, but innovation and security? So I imagine
yeah.
like the fast pace of tech can create some interesting challenges. So how do you like balance that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the most important thing when balancing those two things is really keeping a keen eye on both simultaneously and not over indexing in one direction or another. And I think we have a habit of kind of having tunnel vision when it comes to focusing on sort of the humanistic side of things and understanding that innovation is the key to driving us forward as a society from a humanistic perspective. So I think we need to balance with the humanistic elements, obviously security as the number one priority. And in my work especially, it's something that I'm keenly aware of because people think it's so easy to come in and innovate in an organization that has massive amounts of, capital and wealth. But in reality, there's so many regulations in a lot of these areas that we have to adhere to that makes it really challenging to do innovation in a way that provides, universal access in the same way to the same types of information. And so it's a lot more challenging than people realize to actually make these things a reality. Even though they may technically be possible, they're not possible because we have to adhere to specific guidelines around how we can innovate in a lot of instances. And that makes innovation sort of more of a game than anything, where we have to take a step back and understand how we balance security with innovation, ensuring that both get equal kind of attention while we're doing what we need to do. And it's a delicate dance, and I don't think anyone really is doing it spectacularly, but we all sort of do our best. And a lot of times the best ends up with people getting fined because they did something wrong and they misstepped. And so a lot of people are really scared to do any innovating. And I think that that's a huge disservice as well, because as businesses, we have to keep pushing the envelope further and further because unfortunately we live in a society where there's endless amounts of choice when it comes to making decisions. And so people don't have to just buy your product or engage with your business. And if you're not innovating and making it easy to do business with you, then people are going to go elsewhere. And so at the end of the day, innovation is the key to driving your business forward. So as leaders and business leaders, you really have to do your due diligence to balance both. And it's no different than the legal system and the checks and balances that have to happen there.
I absolutely love what you just said. And a word that stuck out to me was the dance. And when you dance, especially if you're not doing a solo dance, you're dancing with a partner, you have
Mhm.
to have a balance between the both. You might have one that leads or does more leading, but you can't lead if nobody's following you. And so there
Exactly.
has to be a balance and a almost like a teeter totter, um,
Mhm.
or a seesaw, so that you all can both, you know,
And I think that's the important part of a dance too, in using that example, because, as one kind of takes the precedent, the other kind of takes a step back, and does sort of the guiding and versus the leading. And I think we have to take a similar approach with innovation and security, where sometimes security may need to take the lead for a specific purpose, but then innovation needs to jump back in at a later time and take the driver's seat.
yes, absolutely. So, as we are kicking off Cybersecurity Month, because that's the big reason why I truly wanted to interview you, um, there is a rise of cloud technology and automation. It's cloud
Yep.
technology has been around, but there's a rise in the usage of cloud technology. So, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges that we face? Are there any specific risks or issues you feel are often overlooked?
I think the number one thing is the question around security that gets brought up a lot when it comes to cloud technology, and the idea that inherent cloud is inherently less secure than on-prem types of systems and architecture. And I think that is unfortunately a far too common fallacy and that people make, in that they think that their on-prem is somehow just ironclad in all circumstances, and cloud is just so risky. But we have government cloud now, we have medical cloud, we have specific clouds for specific environments that adhere to the security principles within that specific environment. And play nice with all of the different restrictions in those specific environments. And so I think people need to take a step back and realize that cloud is not a one size fits all solution, and that you have specific cloud ecosystems specifically designed to meet your needs. And if you would seek those out instead of trying to make something that isn't designed for your needs work because of cost or whatever, lack of awareness, or some sales guy just took you out to a nice dinner and you agreed to buy his product, which is 9 times out of 10 would actually happen. And we don't need to deal with the after effects of that. So people need to do their due diligence up front to determine what cloud product meets their needs based on what they're trying to do. But another thing is thinking about how different cloud ecosystems interact with one another, because it's great to have your data in the cloud and your information hosted there. But if it doesn't play nice with other clouds due to whatever, that is a whole other can of worms, because then you're creating even more silos again. And cloud's great, but if it's just one more silo, then it's not really as valuable as it really could be. And it's not as different from on-prem as you think. And I think the issue with on-prem similarly is that people rely so heavily on these legacy systems, and it's great, it's secure, but if it doesn't, again, play nice with anything else, then you just have to keep creating legacy systems and keep reinventing the wheel. And there's a reason why these companies exist and they get all this money. They've thought about a lot of the stuff that you're going to have to try to think about on the fly as you're creating these products from scratch. And a lot of organizations are so quick to create, in-house systems and applications. And if it's just going to be bigger headache to save that money, allegedly, that I don't really think that you're actually saving the money that you think you are. So it's worth really taking a step back and understanding the entire architecture as you're considering the journey to cloud versus on-prem. And then also think about things that can happen from an environmental standpoint as it relates to on-prem, especially given the environment that we live in now. From a security standpoint, people rarely think about the environmental risks that go with security. And you could have a tidal wave, you could have a total blackout, you could have a number of things happen, and that on-prem system will go down. And you only have, one way to access that on-prem system. So what do you do now? And versus a cloud, which has multiple, copies of your architecture that it can lean on. So if, one of those data centers goes down, it's not going to completely wipe you out. You can rely on the multiple other data centers that exist for that specific purpose. So there's a lot of other factors. And then lastly, as you're thinking about your sustainability journey, it is actually very unsustainable to waste data. And I don't think people think about that, whether it's being hosted in the cloud or on-prem, but especially if it's being hosted in the cloud, because you're using a lot more processing power, and you're using a lot more data, usually using a lot more of everything in those instances. And the question is, are you just holding things there just for the sake of holding them there? And if so, how much electricity and trees and water are being wasted because you're just holding on to things that you're not even utilizing? So from a sustainability aspect, and from thinking about things like ESG, you don't want to waste data and manpower and energy on information that isn't even being utilized properly in the first place, because that is its own ESG issue.
Wow, thank you for sharing that perspective, because um, to be honest, I had thought about it, but I hadn't really thought about it in the manner that you just shared. And a lot of people do think, it's on ground, it's secure. I don't have to worry about anybody coming in and breaking in physically, um, to violate the space that our on ground services and hardware take up.
And
However,
as a final piece to that too, just to add one more layer to that, another on-prem issue that rarely gets discussed is that now people can actually kidnap your data,
you know,
especially if you have an on-prem infrastructure, and they can shut it down where you can't access your own on-prem data. And that's a whole other ball game when we're talking about like security that you don't want to be put in. And I've seen that happen, and I've seen companies have to actually pay ransoms to
you
get
know,
their own data back, which is nuts. So that's just, a little icing on the cake of that on-prem, supposed security.
yeah. And so when you were talking, I was thinking about where I'm a professor at East Tennessee State University, and the hurricane that just came through, we're many miles inland, but our region, just part of our region, and even we're close to Asheville, North Carolina. And so the hurricane wiped out like access to so much in the region.
Yep.
Um, that people don't necessarily think about things that happen that can destroy your access and your connections to vital data. Like even the hospital was wiped out, but
Yep.
what about medical records that were stored on physical servers in a space? They're no longer there, and getting medication to the right patient
Yep.
at the right time. All of those things are vulnerabilities that we have to be cognizant of as we're planning and then maintaining, updating, and deciding and determining on future infrastructure in these spaces. So I want to change and shift the conversation just a little bit because it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. What can we do personally? What would be your biggest thing, or what are some things that people are not thinking about personally for their personal security to keep them safe in as part of Cybersecurity Awareness Month?
Sure. So I am the daughter of an early stage cyber criminal. My mom was actually heavily engaged in computers herself as well. She was actually the first person, admittedly, that I personally knew that worked on computers. She worked on Sabre for American Airlines, and was what I consider an early coder because she knew the Sabre language. And so that was pretty neat to me growing up. But then seeing, uh, the reality, unfortunately, of undiagnosed autism and ADHD, and the combination of those things in a person that was already struggling with the realities of finding out they were adopted. Unfortunately, not voluntarily finding out either. So that led down sort of a negative path for my mom, which ended up landing her in federal prison and eventually leading to her being unalived. And so I have now kind of worked on coming back from that as being an ally and an advocate for cybercrime and financial crimes and helping people, regular people, and organizations understand the financial and technical implications of financial and cybercrime, but also the human elements as well. And that includes, the human loss, but also how people can protect themselves, how the ordinary person can protect themselves from cybercrime. And unfortunately, people like my mom, who are really good at what they do. And what I can say as someone who has, decades of experience watching cybercrime evolve in real time, um, I can say that the biggest thing is understanding that you have a physical wallet, just like, we were talking about on-prem and cloud environments. I think this is a really good segue into thinking about the difference between a physical wallet and your physical identity and your digital wallet and your digital identity. And the differences as we think about, cloud versus on-prem, we can similarly look at your physical identity versus your digital identity, and what that looks like, and how similarly your digital identity can be hijacked, just like your physical identity can literally be taken out of your pocket and stolen. And so I think getting people to understand that there's different things to think about when it comes to their digital identity and their digital presence and their digital wallet is critical. And that includes looking at it from a personal perspective, but also a professional and business perspective as well. And because you also have your professional identity, just like you have your business that you may be involved with or you may own. And so it's important to think about both because there are a lot of implications from your personal identity, but there's also implications from your professional identity. Examples are I've gotten scams that specifically reached out to me about jobs. And I have a good friend who was scammed in regards to a job. He thought he had a job with an organization. They sent him money, told him to buy something, a laptop. It all seemed legitimate. It was a real company, but it wasn't. It was a scam. And so your professional identity is just as important as your personal identity when it comes to protection and understanding that there are different safeguards for your digital wallet and your professional identity that you have to think about. And thinking about those is more critical now than it's ever been because there's probably people, in your inner circle, unfortunately, more than likely, that are looking to take advantage of you. Scamming is more popular than it's ever been. It's more lucrative than it's ever been. And so it's really attractive to people. There are cybercrime jobs on the dark web as we speak, and a lot of people are also unemployed and desperate. And so it's not always a malicious thing. Sometimes people are really just trying to get by. I think most of the time that's what people are doing, my mom included. And so there's people running around, thinking that they don't have the skills, though, to be engaged in technology. Or maybe they don't feel like they're going to get the same opportunities in technology or the same pay in technology. And so it's also very attractive to go these routes where the same inequalities don't exist. And so it's important to think also about the people in your inner circle and where you may have vulnerabilities with people that you may think really well, that may actually be looking to engage you in cybercrime, unfortunately. So there's a few different things that I think people need to think about, but most importantly, it's that they have these conversations with their inner circles, their family and their friends, and start the conversation, because I don't think enough of us talk about cybercrime, and it's really hard to throw a rock and not know someone that's been victimized in some way as it relates to cybercrime in 2024.
Absolutely. Wow. Um, yeah, it's 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 prevalent. It is everywhere. And as somebody who's been victimized multiple times, it can happen and it seems like back to back to back.
Hmm.
And it can
Yeah.
be like almost pervasive. And a lot of times people think it's only financially, but a true thing, I was living in Houston and someone had gotten a hold of my personal information, and they were trying to get pharmaceutical drugs
Hmm.
under my name. And I think that's right when that like those high level drugs, you had to go through the doctor's office. And I think that's when they first started that process. And so my doctor's office actually called me because they knew at that time I shouldn't be ordering that particular
Yeah.
drug. And so that was like the early stages of it. And that's when I found out they tried to get a credit card. And that's how I found out how much they were trying to infiltrate my life based on and only pieces of information. They didn't even
Mhm.
have the correct and full picture of who I was, but they were beginning to kind of essentially hijack who I was digitally. And so, yes, that is absolutely important that we think about our physical and digital sides of our experience in this life and make sure we protect it at all costs.
Yeah,
Um,
and think about what we share with others because it's really easy to share everything about your personal life online. But I urge you to be very strategic about who you share things with, knowing that that information can and might very well be used against you at some point. And this could end up being even a matter of life or death for some people
Absolutely.
because it's gotten bad enough that people have gotten to the point of unaliving themselves over these situations. And that's the unfortunately also part of the human toll.
Absolutely. Oh, wow. So as we've been having this conversation, I think it's given our listeners a lot to, number one, think about when it comes to balancing that security. How do you secure yourself? Who do you trust? And do you trust anybody? Because what we don't
Hmm.
want to do is fall out of what you said was that balance where we're trying to protect ourselves so much we can't trust anybody.
Yeah.
And we
Yep.
don't become the mattress stuffers with all of our money stuffed in a mattress because we're so scared to do anything. Um,
Hmm.
but balancing that, the security, the trust, and the forward momentum of innovation.
Yeah.
So before we close, is there can you give me one piece of advice? Like if there is one place that people can start as they try to navigate the digital landscape. And if you want to break it down into kind of like generations, like what are some things that those who are early teenagers to young adults can think about to protect themselves? And then the kind of that middle of the road group. And then the group that is very close to my heart. And I'm like, I don't even know how to help them sometimes, but our older generation who seems to be targeted over and over and over again. What is a piece of advice or a starting point that they can start at trying to balance those things for themselves?
Well, I think the most important thing for everyone, regardless of age or technology level, is understanding the importance of cyber hygiene and digital hygiene in general. And understanding that just like we have financial hygiene and, different types of hygiene, it's important for us to think about our cyber hygiene. And so it starts with, teaching things from a young age, and modeling behaviors that we want to see in the younger generations, but also kind of being a guide for the vulnerable populations that exist around us, whether that be the elderly, the disabled, the young, all of these different vulnerable populations, obviously people of color, women, all of these groups are actually more likely to be victimized. So it's important to think just like we do in the physical realm, all the same people that are vulnerable in the physical realm to abuse are just as vulnerable in the digital space. And so I think if we start there by understanding that just like we have to protect vulnerable populations in the physical realm, we have to do the same in the digital realm. Everything that exists in the physical realm exists in the digital realm. And I think if we go in with that mindset as a square one, we'll be in a good place. And so, think to yourself, would I share this with a person that I just met on the street? And if not, maybe I don't want to post this online because whether it's grandma or it's a, 5-year-old, it's important to teach people of all ages that, what we share online is just like sharing in a physical environment. And so the question is, would I say this, if we were face to face? And if not, then maybe I don't want to post it online, because that information could potentially be used against me in the future. And so I think that's the starting point. But then I think also just ensuring that that means you're also maintaining your information, going in and checking what you're sharing, asking other people to look at your profile. If you are, wondering what's there, ask, people like, hey, do you see XYZ? That's also a great place. If you're not as technologically savvy, you don't know how to go in and kind of adjust the settings, you can always start with having a conversation with your friends and just ask them, can you see this? Can you see that? And if they can see those certain things, that's a starting point for you to start doing some hygiene and some cleanup. It's really easy to set settings where only certain people can see certain things too. So maybe you want to consider some personalization and some customization as well. I urge you not to just share the same information with everyone. You may not want to set your profile to private necessarily, but that's also a great place to start too, setting your profiles to private and then start managing the information, proving the information down. And then if you decide after that you want to set it to public, by all means, now you're in a good place to do so. So setting things to private, cleaning up, and then maybe making the decision whether you want to continue as private or then move over to maybe creating public profiles in a very controlled way, I think is the approach that I would suggest regardless of age. And if there's someone who's newer to technology, it's especially important to have those conversations very early on so people establish those good hygiene habits early on, and then it becomes second nature, and you don't even have to think about it. I talk to my 11-year-old all the time about these kind of things, and she talks about how her friends and even her teachers don't know a lot of these things. And so anyone can be a leader and be someone who takes charge when it comes to these conversations, but the important thing is that those who do have the awareness try to help uplift those who don't.
Oh my
And
goodness.
then
Go ahead.
and
Go
then it's
ahead.
just one final piece as it relates specifically to researchers and PhDs. I think one of the things that is not really being discussed is intellectual property. In particular, is something that we have to be very diligent about protecting and maintaining the security and safety of, because that's just one example of how we're specifically targeted. But I've also similarly been targeted with, fake teaching jobs overseas and all sorts of things like that as well that are specific to what I do as a professional. And they can see from the information about me that this is what I do. This is an area where they can easily see this vulnerability. So on the professional side, it's the same thing. Think about the information you're sharing and whether or not you feel comfortable with anyone all over the world having this information about you. And if not, maybe it's time to again set things to private, start cleaning things up. And then after you feel like you have your hygiene in a better place, maybe then reevaluate if you have like a public professional persona, and what you keep kind of private to those who need to see it.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, especially for broadening my question, because I was thinking only age, but you are right. There are vulnerable populations that are physically vulnerable, but there is the same way in the digital landscape. And so thank you for broadening the question to include those different areas. Um, One of the things that I'll just say it irks me is when I do see on say like Facebook or Instagram, happy 50th birthday today. When I see that phrase, I cringe. I was like, you just gave somebody your full birthday without saying I was born such a, you gave them all the information they need to, like if that was the last piece they needed from you, they have it immediately. And so cleaning up and being very aware of our digital hygiene is really, really critical in this space, especially when social media is very prevalent and everybody uses it. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people use it for a lot of different things. And so it's so easy to, people are vulnerable and they're just trying to say, hey, congratulations, or encourage you and celebrate you. They have genuine desires, but to the right person, it can be weaponized against that person. And even reaching out and communicating with other people and posing as somebody's friend with the bits and pieces of information in order to find a spot of vulnerability is something else that we have to be aware of. So thank you for your answer and broadening that question. Well, that's all I had for today. Do you have anything else you wanted to share before we kind of sign off?
No, I'll just kind of share just um I guess top three things I would do to clean up my profile. Um, one, like you sort of mentioned, any sort of like specific personal information, whether that be your middle name, your exact date of birth with your year, all that sort of stuff. You definitely want to be aware of who has access to that if you do have a public page available. And then even if you do have a private page, my second piece of advice is go through your friends list regularly with that in mind. That's a big component of hygiene is ensuring, who has the most access to you and your digital kind of identity is really maintained in a way that is aware that, you may not want the same person to have access to that information who you did a few years ago. And so it's worth regularly going through that list and weeding people out, getting rid of people as necessary to ensure even if your page is private, that it's still just the people who need to have access to that information. And be aware of what you're posting. Finally, in your professional spaces as well, because that can be combined with your personal information to, again, target you in very, very sophisticated ways if people are looking to hack you. And so it's the whole package when it comes to your digital identity that you have to be aware of and maintaining the hygiene around.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So thank you
Mhm.
so very much. You don't understand how much I am appreciative of this time that you spent with me today. It's been very
No
eye
problem.
opening. Um, and even with what I do, I thought I knew a lot. You, my sister, know a lot. so I
Yeah.
I know our listeners will take away so much from it. And for those listening, make sure you stay tuned for more insightful discussions this Cyber Security Awareness Month. Until next time, remember whether it's education, technology, or life itself, there's always something new to learn and exchange. This is Doc Wise signing off. Stay curious and keep exploring.